Hello and welcome to this edition of the Modern Investor Journey. My name is Rod Hurd, co-founder of SmartBe Wealth Inc, and I'm here with my partner Art Johnson. Today we're delighted to have a fellow Calgarian on the show, Maddie Quinlan. Maddie is a director and co-founder of Salient Behavioural Consultants and the head of mentorship of the Global Association of Applied Behavioral Scientists. Maddie's years of in-depth industry experience center in the fintech and energy sectors via ShareWorks by Morgan Stanley, a pioneering fintech entrant in the options management sector, and ICE NGX, an innovative clearinghouse for commodities trading. Maddie holds a Master's of Behavioral Science from the London School of Economics and Political Science. In addition, she holds her CFA charter and degrees in both finance and psychology. Maddie, it's just so great to have you on the show. Welcome aboard.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to talk to you today.
Wow, Matt, I didn't know your CV was that deep. I'm not even close. That's damn good. Welcome.
That's the whole thing. That's the whole thing, top to bottom.
I'd like to take a stab because I in getting ready for this, I went back and read Misbehaving by Thaler. And
by Richard Thaler.
Yeah. And I guess one thing that just jumped out on the page with me is, and I think this will hopefully explain behavioral economics, but you can obviously, I'm being the overconfident male here, Maddie, because my CV doesn't have the degree, but
let's hear it. Let's
hear what the overconfident male comes up with. But one of the things that fascinated me right out of the gates is he was terrified as a young professor, and the data was pretty simple, is that, what does it say here? Grades, anything over an 80 basically in his class got an A or an A minus. Scores between 60, you'd get a B at around 65. Anything lower than a 50, you got a C. And it was very rare for the kids in his class to get a C. But because he wanted to make people happy, he made his exams with a 137-point schedule instead of 100. And what he was fascinated by, that the average became what he calls a cheery 96. And so all of the students were absolutely happier. And what's fascinating about this is such behavioral economics, is that framing is such a big deal. And for a bunch of good students to get a C, frame them horribly. But very rarely, he said, would they ever get a 96. And then a bunch of them were producing scores that were higher than 100, which was just amazing. Yet the data would say they got the exact same distribution of A, Bs, and Cs. And so I thought that was a really kind of good lead into what behavioral finance is, because a classic economist would say that those kids are misbehaving and that their behavior was kind of inconsistent with an idealized model. So I thought that'd be a kind of really cool way to start, and we can talk around issues like that. But yeah, what do you think? Is that a good description, or am I way off the mark?
You're reading Thaler very, very well. The example there is a pretty clear example of the way that we frame information. And so, as you said, the distribution and the grade itself actually is no different. And you'd have the same range, whether you scored it out of 100 or 137 in this case. But the way that people anchor to the number 100, because that's how they're used to being graded, gives them that reference point. And sort of one of the central tenets of behavioral economics is this idea that everything becomes relative to a reference point or an anchor. This comes up a ton in behavioral finance, of course, when we think about pricing and the markets. But in the case that you give, it also kind of then links into prospect theory, which is the idea that the difference from a reference point, whether it's above or below, has a very, very different impact emotionally for us. So a gain gives us a certain degree of joy. But if you were to suffer a loss of the same amount, we see almost twice as much pain as we do experience pleasure by the same amount. So yeah, a really, really interesting example. So, are they misbehaving? They're just falling victim to their, pretty inherent emotional biases around that reference point.
That makes a lot of sense, Maddie, to me. And so how do you, as a behavioral scientist, and you're now co-founder of Salient Behavioural Consultants, how does the theory around how humans interact with things like anchoring, framing, and all of the other aspects of our internal biases, what's the type of consulting work that you're doing right now? What are the types of problems that your clients are trying to solve through the use of scientific method?
When my business partner and I were doing our masters, it became really clear that in order to work in this field, one of the most important things to do is to really understand the fundamentals that come from academia. So to really understand, what is the theory behind all of this? What have studies kind of shown us is that real human condition about decision making and behavior? And then how do we bridge that gap between what we think we know in theory, lab tests and academic research and papers, and how do we translate that out into the real world? And that's basically what our ethos has been from the beginning, is to say, how do we take those insights but change the context? So we know really clearly that context changes behavior. Your environment, what's around you, the lens that you have, the information that you have at the time of a decision is so impactful to what your decision or your behavior will actually be. And so we can't rely all the time on what we think we know in theory to actually be the case out in the real world and in the field. So what we endeavor to do is to facilitate the projects that we are on with that knowledge of where it comes from and that theory, but to understand that we must experiment. We must test it in field, in the context that we want to see the result in order to actually understand whether we're making a robust impact.
Can you give us some examples?
Yeah, sure. So we are working with a nonprofit who is interested in understanding how they can gamify an app in order to enhance a mother's predisposition to eat iron-rich foods and take care of herself while pregnant. So these are pregnant mothers that before the COVID pandemic were going to in-person one-to-ones with a facilitator to understand the importance of, are you getting enough iron? Are you taking rest? How are you taking care of yourself so that you can have a healthy pregnancy and a healthy baby? And so what we're endeavoring to do, because the COVID pandemic has meant that those one-to-one meetings and interactions are no longer possible, how can we gamify this, put it on an app, and have intelligent design and behavioral nudges to enhance those really healthy behaviors? So examples of interventions are things like message framing. The words that we use about taking care of yourself to take care of your child. If we word things slightly differently, we're going to have a really different result potentially. But we want to be able to A/B test that in the app. Intelligent notification timing. So knowing how many times to gently nudge through some kind of notification on an app without overwhelming someone who's using it, so that they are not becoming desensitized or numb to that information. So it's really about, how do we deliver the right information in the right amount at the right time and measure whether or not we're making an impact on that behavior. Another example from the financial sector is around message framing as well. And it has to do with encouraging the self-employed to save into their pensions. Because we know that in a lot of traditional employment, employers automatically deduct from a pay stub, essentially, and sweep that money into a pension savings for like a private pension. But the self-employed really fall outside of that regulation. This is in the, sorry, I'll back up for a second. So this was done in the UK. And in order to kind of close the gap of pension savings between what the overall population will eventually be needing and how much people were actually saving into their private pensions, what they did is they rolled out something called automatic enrollment. And by this mechanism, employers were required to enroll their employees in a pension savings program and to automatically sweep some deduction of their income into that pension. Now, of course, employees could opt out, but they were defaulted in.
Yeah.
And what we know about defaults is that if something is automatically turned on, quote unquote, you'll be much more likely to go with the flow and not to make the choice to opt out. We see that with tick boxes, we see that with terms and conditions, see that all the time. So this was the strategy of the UK government and the way that they addressed this. And what they noticed is that there was a huge uptake in this program and a huge increase in private pension savings. What they noticed was that self-employed people who were not a part of this program because they are needing to save for themselves were falling behind in their pension savings. And so what a project that I was doing was trying to enhance was this invitation to save into your pension. And one of the first experiments that we did was to understand how message framing impacts people's financial decision making in regards to saving for the long term. So we asked a focus group of participants that are self-employed a series of questions and sort of brainstormed some ideas of what kind of message frames we could give to the self-employed to really encourage them to save for the future. And these were things like making it a palatable contribution. So saying, for only $2.50 or £2 and £2.50, you could be on your way to a really healthy financial future. That's kind of one message frame, making something palatable and small so it doesn't feel insurmountable.
Pack it away, you'll get rich.
Exactly. Just keep it small, but keep it going. And then the next one was a tax incentive, right? So there are big tax benefits to saving into your pension. Another one was flexibility. So, the self-employed, sometimes their income is very chunky when you're doing a startup, or you're not really sure when the next one is coming in, when the next project is going to pay out. So telling them that, you can do what you can when you can over time. And then the last one that we did had to do with loss aversion. So loss aversion is kind of what I mentioned before, that really weighty feeling we feel when we lose an amount versus when we gain an amount. So the message frame is essentially, if you had started saving in 2012, here's what you could have by now. So you're missing out on this money that could have accumulated over time. And the focus group hated it. They hated that message. They were like, I don't want to hear that. That's very negative. That wouldn't turn my gears to get me to save more at all. But I thought, I think we should test it because we know so much about prospect theory. We know so much about how emotional we get when we're losing. So I thought we should test this. So we roll it out in an email campaign to several thousand self-employed individuals. And what we find is the ones that we thought would do extremely well. So like the tax incentive one, we got a lot of great feedback because people just didn't know that was a thing, did not do well in field. The click-through rate and predisposition to then sign up to get an automatic savings going, tax didn't do well. The one that did the best was the loss aversion.
Fear.
So I say all of this to say that the importance of taking a scientific approach to testing these insights in the context in which you are doing them is absolutely critical, because otherwise we really don't know if we're making an improvement or not.
So Maddie, what was the disconnect between the focus group and the reality?
Yeah, how did people brainwash themselves to thinking that would suck?
Yeah, that's a great question, and such an important one in the context of behavioral science and behavioral economics. So what people say and what they do are often completely at odds.
My children say that to me all the time, Maddie. I totally disagree, but you keep going, but... do
as I say, not as I do,
and
right?
They also say the rules are for me, or for them, not for me, and I totally disagree, but you keep going with this science stuff.
It's a key tenet of behavioral science, and from what I've heard, might be a key tenet of parenting as well. I can't give firsthand on that one, but essentially, we have a real intense amount of cognitive dissonance, who we imagine ourselves to be and the way that we actually end up showing up in the world. And we try to reconcile those things mentally. So what this ends up meaning is, so it's partially that. It's partially we want to come off a certain way. We want to say, yeah, I totally would be willing to save into a pension. I would love to do that. But when it really comes down to it, letting go of that money really doesn't feel good. Our behavior is misaligned. So it's partially that. It's also partially that we really don't know ourselves all that well. So we're not really familiar with our own blind spots and our biases. And this is something that we really endeavor to do as behavioral scientists, is to really use examples where we can hold up a mirror to people, including ourselves, and say, where are my blind spots? Where might I be falling short in the way that my decisions and my behaviors are not for my best interest?
I think that's a very important insight, because behavioral finance and with the stuff you're doing is basically taking in a more enriched approach to, it's not another part of economics, it's actually part of economics, but it's enriching the belief that we're dealing with humans and the choices they make. I do want to contrast so people really understand the difference. To most people, they would say that seems absolutely logical. That's what an economist should be studying. But actually, it is very different from the original glory that got economics away from traditional social sciences. And let me just dive into that a bit. Because Thaler, I think, framed it perfectly. He said traditional economics is optimization plus equilibrium. So optimization is exactly what you're talking about. It is the belief that we actually know ourselves quite well, and that if I go into a situation, the ones you've described, I will be able to make rational choices because I know myself so well that will come out. And then the other one is equilibrium, which our listeners hopefully get a sense for, is that it stems from the idea that markets are efficient, that supply, demand, and price will all meet at some point in an equilibrium, and they won't be distorted. So, and why, I guess, for our listeners, that was a really important thing is that up until economics could show true models, it was discounted as a social science, and it got a ton of cred around these models. And I guess in academic work, the closer you are to physics, the better off you are. So economics kind of jumped into the highlight with these models, even though they did not have the nuance of behavioral finance. Can you speak a little bit to that? Have I characterized that properly, Maddie? Or
Sure. Yeah. I think you. Yeah. No. I agree absolutely. So those neoclassical economic assumptions that were held to be true, they have to do with, as you say, sort of this perfectly rational actor. So who has the ability to make utility maximizing decisions. So what is the absolute maximum that I can get out of this by making a certain decision? And the other part is that there's perfect information. So we have access to all information at all times in order to make the best decisions for ourselves. Now, if you look at the Venn diagram between those economic assumptions and what happens in reality, they probably don't even touch. And if they do, it's a very small amount. So what we endeavor
they touch
to
for
do
Mr. Spock.
Behavioral. Yeah, exactly. They touch. And you never see those, you'd never see those become one circle. That Venn diagram would never perfectly overlap. So, then what we do as behavioral scientists and behavioral economists is to understand those deviations from rationality, endeavor to say, what can we expect? And then what can we do to kind of improve those models? How can we describe behavior instead of trying to predict behavior? Because we know that those predictive models based on those rational economic assumptions are going to be far off the mark when we look at reality. And so then what we can do is, if we understand the deviations from reality in a robust way, we can start to help people improve their decision making. We can start to design interventions. You'll hear the term nudging. We can allow people the space to make better decisions for themselves as they would define it. So this idea of, paternalism comes up quite a bit when we think about nudging. It's like, well, who gets to decide what information we're giving to people to guide them in a direction? Is nudging ethical? And what libertarian paternalism says is, if you are looking at nudging from the standpoint of this person would define their better outcome or their greater well-being as XYZ, and we can help them get there, that's an ethical nudge. That's libertarian paternalism, because it's defined by them, but facilitated behind the scenes.
So a seatbelt would be an example of that. Is that fair?
I mean, so people don't want to die in car accidents. It depends if you mean seatbelt or if you mean seatbelt laws.
Mm-hmm.
What about in the case of what's going on right now with face mask, no face mask? Who has the authority or the moral right position to build nudges to make people wear face masks or not? Is this a type of moral dilemma that you have to think through in your experimental design to do the right thing?
Yeah. Absolutely, absolutely. And it becomes a huge issue when we think about behavioral science in policymaking, because then you get into, you can open a whole chestnut about, who's making what decisions and how are they carrying them out. What we hope is that the people that are in positions of power are using robust and sound data to make those decisions. And then we're choosing some kind of set of, cost benefit analysis and making a decision based on that, so that we can then say, okay, how do we modify behavior? And then behavioral scientists can come in and say, how do we encourage people to do this?
But how does it work in the capitalist realm when money's involved and, it's profitability, and is the man out to nudge us to open our wallets? Who's to say that is there a policing environment? Is there a code of ethics?
That's a great question. And that's something that I've been thinking a lot about lately, which is, how much do we rely on individual autonomy in markets and expect people to take responsibility for that autonomy?
It's really difficult to increase financial literacy at the best of times. It's really difficult to explain concepts about the financial markets to the masses.
Well, wouldn't the evidence be that actually it doesn't work? Like, most of the evidence says financial literacy doesn't even make a dent. Is that correct?
Traditional financial education tends not to make a dent in financial literacy.
Okay.
That's exactly right. So we have a lot of evidence to say that. Now, what we've done as a market.
So can we just stop there for a sec, Maddie? Like, I mean, you've obviously spent some time on that. Wouldn't that? I mean, you're in this field. When you read that, did that just humble the hell out of you? Like, why? Why can't we teach financial literacy?
Well, things like numeracy and the sort of more abstract concepts that come along with financial decision making are difficult for us.
Sorry, what is numeracy, Maddie?
So our ability to deal with numbers, basically, right? So we have a really hard time imagining what numbers really mean in practice. So what is the actual impact of all of these things that I'm seeing, all of these numbers that I'm seeing in a financial market, for example? And in addition to that, we are also heavily influenced by our emotions when we're making decisions, right? Which leads to all of these biases, because, again, coming back to prospect theory, how bad it feels to lose, not even as high of a gain could really overcome that loss. It leads to these really irrational and erratic decisions with our financial lives. So it's a really important and I don't think insurmountable challenge to increase financial literacy. I just think that traditional financial education has now been well documented to not be the way of it.
So what's the brave new way?
Yeah, there are ways to deliver better information, and this almost comes back to what I had mentioned with the nonprofit organization and delivering information through that app. So there's something called just-in-time information. And essentially what that means is, as I said before, the right information in the right amount. So smaller pieces of information, but very relevant to the exact decision that you're about to make. So I'll give you an example of my business partner, an experiment that he did in his dissertation. And it had to do with the disposition effect, which is the predisposition in a financial market for an investor to basically get out at the wrong time and get in at the wrong time. And
also hold their holdings forever too, Maddie, right? Like if they have a big loss, they'll hold that stock to come back forever rather than take the money and build more utility with it.
Exactly. Yeah. So they'll hold on to a losing position. They'll leave when it's low. They'll buy when it's high. And we see that not only with retail investors, we see this with institutional and professional traders as well. What the experiment did was to give a nudge in between two different sets of analyses based on candlestick charts, right? So you have those candlestick charts, you show them 5 of them, you ask them what they would do. And then in the middle, you give them a little definition of what the disposition effect is, right? So you say, this is kind of how people tend to behave, and it's biased.
Here's the mirror.
Then you give them 5 more. So that's like a very, very clear nudge, right? That's like a very just-in-time, hey, just so you know, this is the thing that you might be doing.
Maddie, can you guys stop that? Maddie, can you guys stop that, please? Because we believe that most of the profits from our momentum portfolios comes from that misbehavior.
Oh, perfect. Okay. Yeah. So then this comes back. Then this becomes like a moral dilemma, right? It's like
Exactly.
making money off of biases, and this is what our entire market, will struggle with. But what we see is that you can actually improve behavior. You can actually decrease a disposition effect with something as simple as that kind of idea of just-in-time information. So that's one example.
Is that just a one-time thing, Maddie, or back to the concept of financial literacy? Sure. You've described a methodology of just-in-time information to nudge someone into a better decision, a better financial decision based on a very specific set of circumstance. But the permutations and the numbers of decisions that we make every day in a financial context are infinite, and I can't imagine a universe where every single decision we have to make has the best for me nudge built into it. If we can't improve Rod's or Art's ability to make decisions in real time through financial literacy, and we know that the universe of nudges isn't large enough, are there other ways that people can help themselves?
Yeah, a great question. And so much of what I think, at least for individual investors and their portfolios, what we endeavor to do is actually to have them make less decisions overall. Mm-hmm. There's a lot less room for error in decision making if you simplify the amount that you're making. We saw, I think it was Fidelity. This was several years ago, but what they actually ended up finding was that the best performing accounts that they had were for people that had forgotten they had an account altogether.
They had either died or forgotten them. Yeah.
So sometimes the best thing that we can do is nothing at all. And so what can we do to create context? And a lot of the time now, this all happens, online and on platforms. But we think about, what is the context of the decision? What are the pieces of choice architecture? So the bits and bobs that are hanging around, whether it's a click box here or an extra screen here, that will lead people to be able to make a sounder decision for their financial lives.
Maddie, has there been any work done? Because, I just want to bring it all back to me and my children. We started with this program called Cozy around chores. I have two 16-year-old daughters, and they're not too fond of chores for some reason. And what I found very quickly is that the notifications died. And I noticed this myself. I start my meditation app, and then I get really tired of notifications. Has there been any efforts done to look at randomizing, maybe for a financial advisor that at different times a notification would go out, but maybe a physical call would go out? Is anyone going down that lane? And then I guess the other thing, I don't know if you're aware of, have you ever seen the paper, The Misguided Beliefs of Retail Advisors in Canada? Have you ever read that one?
I haven't.
Oh, okay. Well, because it talks to a lot about what you're trying to reform and trying to make people better, but it basically comes to the conclusion that actually advisors themselves believe in trading too much, buying high-cost funds, and even when they leave the industry, they continue the behaviors. So we can produce all of the nudges and cheap funds and various things, but if the advisory community has seminal flawed beliefs that not only carry on, so they're buying the same stuff as their clients. It's not a conflict of interest piece. So tackle the notifications things first, and then talk about, how do we do these things if people have an advisory system that have flawed beliefs, if you can elucidate on that.
So in terms of the randomization of notification timing, I haven't personally done a study in that realm. And I'm not completely familiar with how broad that evidence base is. What I would imagine, what I would have as my hypothesis, based on what we know about incentives and the way that our attention is, salience, things like that, is that notifications that are regular at the same time, same, over and over and over, lose traction over time. We get very bored of the same thing over and over. Status quo does not gather our attention. Mm-hmm. Salience, novelty, something that's unexpected, that's what we're talking about when we really need to change a behavior. So what I would imagine and what, kind of we've planned out in certain projects actually that we're doing right now is to say the timing of the notification should not be at the same time every day. I've experienced this like in my personal life on apps. So I think I mentioned when we were introducing that I'm reading a book by Sam Harris, but he also has a meditation app, and I use his meditation app. So I do the meditation in the morning every day, but what he actually created in the app as well were these things called moments. And at a random time during your day, you set kind of the earliest time and the latest time so that it's at least hitting you when you're in your waking hours. But any time in between those hours, you will get one notification that says, take a moment. And it's just like a 1 minute little kind of mini recording, little insight, little meditation, just a little kind of deep breath sometime during your day. But it never comes at exactly the same time. And I respond to that as much more responsive than I do when I have something that, I get this every day at 8
4 o'clock's coming, I better take my moment.
If I don't know when it's coming, I'm like, yeah, got my attention. I think I will do that. So that feels stickier, that kind of notification timing. So the randomness of that, I believe, is interesting. I also think, and this kind of takes it one step further into the sort of AI and technological sphere, is if you can have something that learns when people are responsive. So you're actually understanding what their behaviors are through data, then you can actually have it deliver based on that insight. So if we know that you tend to be on your phone at this time, or we know that you tend to be in between meetings at this time, based on all of this data that we have from your calendars and the way that you interact with your phone, for example, this is, putting away the fact that data consolidation and privacy and all that stuff. But let's say we know all these things and we can know all these things, then we can learn what is the best time for you as an individual. And to me, that's really the next era of behavioral science, is to take this from the general population. What do we know what most people do? How do we nudge people at the margins at a large enough population to make a difference? To be personalized, to tailor nudging, to tailor these insights based on more and more robust data that we have access to as a population. So that to me is sort of the next era of behavioral science, is how do we take this from the general to the really personal?
There was another thing I read, which I thought was really profound too. People really reacted poorly if tech companies acted like they knew them. And do you have any insight into that? Like, I thought that was really profound, that in the new marketing age, like when, you see some of these notifications, like they're my best friend. And I actually react quite negatively to that.
Yeah. So I think that this is something that, again, is important to test before you start to roll these things out. I think that the risk when people are designing these kinds of nudges based around these insights is they think, personal language, that'll definitely get us closer to our client. And without actually testing that and just rolling something like that out, you get what's called almost a backfiring effect, which we can see if we haven't tested things properly, is that we understand then that, actually people react really negatively to this. There's a balance between understanding you and feeling like you're known to them. I think that's an interesting differentiation between, understanding your needs and facilitating those is one thing. Pretending like we are best friends when we know that it's a for-profit company that
it's really disingenuous
just wants our data and really just wants to milk us for all we're worth, then it comes across as disingenuous and we're not interested anymore, or we're really averse to that. So I think that the wiser that people get about these kind of things, the more transparent companies are going to need to be, because that kind of pseudo-familiar language, it doesn't come across as authentic anymore.
So Maddie, you've spent a lot of time both in the business aspect and studying and now becoming a leading practitioner in the space. What would you say the percentage of bad actors out there are? Have you run across any, or is there any research that indicates that a bunch of these nudges aren't necessarily trying to do the best for the individual? They have alternate goals in mind.
This is tough, and I would hesitate to even try to put a percent to it. When I think about behavioral science in practice, because of the relatively new nature of it as a field compared to something like, I don't know, accounting or being a lawyer, things that have been around in practice, very familiar to people for a very long time. The actual practice of behavioral science in business, in policymaking, is still relatively new. And so the idea that anybody can call themselves a behavioral scientist is of concern, because you can read nudge or you can read misbehaving, start doing some seminars, and call yourself a behavioral scientist without fully understanding the impact of the actions that you're taking on a population, for example, not taking into account potentially backfiring effects, potential spillover effects, potential externalities to what you're trying to do. And so this is something that became really interesting to me when I first started getting more familiar with behavioral science. I thought, is there a body that kind of regulates who is able to do this? Because there will be these misaligned incentives and a lot of moral hazard when you're thinking about the tools to change people's behavior and the ability to do so with relative ease. So what's come since that sort of little nugget that I had been thinking about when I first got into the space is I realized that there were a lot of other practitioners that were very well qualified that had this same question and had this same concern. And at a conference at LSE a couple of summers ago now, we were part of a panel talking about the commercialization of behavioral science and the ethical and practical implications of this kind of explosion in this wave of uptake in behavioral science and practice. And what we kind of, committed to do in that panel was to say, we intend to form a body that will certify what a member looks like, what a behavioral scientist looks like, what a behavioral scientist adheres to in terms of a code of ethics, And so what we did is we established the Global Association of Applied Behavioral Scientists, and we formed last year. We have a membership now. We're so relatively new and growing every day.
And you're head of membership.
I'm head of membership. Yes. Yeah. And it's been such an incredible journey in establishing this body, because it's, what do we stand for? And it is basically to represent the interests of behavioral scientists and to sort of protect the practice, to say those people that are unqualified, that probably shouldn't be doing this, they don't get to have the stamp of you're a member of this organization. So we're basically saying, you're in a global network of people that are doing this work and they are committing to do it well. And of course, this will, evolve over time as the practice evolves, as insights evolve. But I think it's a very important first step in understanding, how can we protect this field.
That's a fantastic initiative. And I think it's like self-regulating organizations around the world. They do probably the best job than government coming in and trying to impose regulations on the practice. So we have about 5 minutes left, Art and Maddie. Art, do you have any things that you want to talk about to make sure we cover what we wanted to with Madeline?
Yeah, I just want to make sure that that organization has room for someone in my field that I would at best call myself researcher storyteller. So if I can get a certificate for that, Maddie, I'd love that.
Well, we will look for your application to come through, and we will see how that goes.
That's about as high as a certification I'd ever give myself. But no, it's for me, as I've grown along the same lines, it sounds like you're doing, the integration of wisdom, whether it's through Sam Harris or just like understanding that people, the mystery of people is something that I think has to be brought into this conversation. I think one of the failings of our society now is we've kind of tried to expunge mystery from things. We want everything to be black or white and right or wrong, and if you don't listen to me and various things like that. But in economics and in behavior and all that, there's still just a ton of mystery that's why it's such an exciting field to be in. So that's kind of my take on this whole thing.
Yeah, it is. And it's a real humbling experience to realize just how much we don't know about people and how much there is left to discover in this field. I think if someone tells you that they've got it all figured out, that's an easy red flag to know that they don't know what they're talking about. these questions, what they bring are more and more questions. And we can start to have more insight. We can start to have more information. But this is ever growing because, I mean, if you know anything about the human mind, it's that we will probably never figure all of it out.
So where's Maddie in 5 years from now? Where's your consulting business, Salient Behavioural? Paint us a picture of your vision.
Yeah, I've been very excited at how things have been developing even in the last year. COVID aside, it's been a really fundamental year for the growth of not only the business, but for GABS and the other initiatives that I'm working on. For me, what the ultimate dream is to be able to, center somewhere, whether that's Calgary, and to basically sort of flower out. If you kind of draw a flower all around, petals out and in, out and in, out and in, and sort of to go to where I need to be in the world to be with clients or engaging with initiatives or doing research, but doing what I'm doing. It's really just scaling it at this point. It's like, how can I take who I am and the things that I think I bring to this field, make that what I do with a really strong ethos and commitment to doing it well, and then change the world just by doing that. Because I think you attract the people that then are on the same page as you, right? When I mentioned GABS, it's like those people kind of naturally fell together and said, we've all been thinking about this. We all care about this. We're all moving in that same direction. And so then you sort of have this community of like-minded individuals who are working towards the same things that you are. And at scale, that's how you change the world. That's how you change the face of a practice. So that's maybe like a very high level of my 5-year plan, but essentially it's doing this, but doing it bigger.
That's awesome. And Art and I will both look forward to engaging with you along that journey. So this has been so fabulous to have you on the show, Maddie. And if I took 3 major points away from my lens, the first one was this whole thing is everything is relative to a reference. We're always anchored, and it's always a point of anchoring that we need to think about any decision that we make in life. I think that's just fascinating and sage advice for all of us as we take our journey, whether it's through parenting or consulting or financial decisions. The second concept that struck me was this whole libertarian paternalism. It's a big word, but this concept of we are starting to now be able to experiment to understand how humans behave, but I think we're going to be all right as a society as long as we hold to the tenet that we're trying to help people make decisions that are good for themselves, that we don't have ulterior motives or negative motives. I thought that was a very refreshing concept, especially in the context of your GABS or Global Association of Applied Behavioral Scientists and the good work that you're trying to move forward in the future. That was another great takeaway for me. Then I think the final one came back to your and Art's conversation around making money and financial decisions in the market, that too many decisions can be dangerous for your health, and just like set it and forget it is a good strategy. So don't trade your way into some future state of being. So thank you so much. We really enjoyed having you, Maddie. You've been listening to The Modern Investor Journey. My name is Rod Hurd, and I've been here with my partner, Art Johnson, co-founder of SmartBe Wealth. We've had the great pleasure today to talk to Maddie Quinlan, who's a behavioral scientist and co-founder of Salient Behavioural Consultants. Thanks so much for being on the show, Maddie.
Thank you so much. It's been a great conversation.
The information contained in this podcast is 1, for Canadian residents only, 2, for informational purposes only, and 3, not intended to be, nor shall it be interpreted as, a recommendation or the provision of advice, including without limitation financial, investing, sales, marketing, legal, accounting, or tax advice, and shall not be relied upon by you in that regard. SmartBe Wealth Inc. cannot guarantee the accuracy of any information contained in this podcast that is derived from third-party sources, although we believe those sources to be reliable. SmartBe Wealth Inc. and its affiliates may receive compensation derived from investments in or sales of its products or both. SmartBe Wealth Inc.'s products described in this podcast may not be applicable or available with respect to all investors and may change without notice. Past performance does not guarantee future comparable results. Exchange-traded funds, ETFs, are not guaranteed. Their values change frequently and past performance may not be repeated. Investors will pay management fees and expenses, but they will not pay commissions or trailing commissions, and they may experience a gain or loss from their investment in or sale of an ETF. You may request a prospectus for an ETF from your financial advisor by visiting smartbewealth.com or by calling SmartBe Wealth Inc. at 403-930-8693. The prospectus includes investment objectives, risks, fees, expenses, and other information that you should consider carefully before investing. Please consult a lawyer or tax professional regarding your specific legal or tax situation, respectively.